Hey, everybody, Adam and John back with another episode of the Bowhunter Chronicles podcast. Another one of these Zoom podcasts. John's still on social distancing. We just finished our turkey hunt yesterday where half of it was me outside of the blind. And then finally, when we did get it done, it was two guys, two different blinds, and then Frank and Ernie behind us, 6 feet apart on the ground, and had the turkeys run closer than 6 feet right past them. And it was exciting day, but another story for another day. And today's guest that we have on the line is a guy that I first heard. So one of the first podcasts I ever listened to was one of the Wired to Hunt podcasts, and Mark Kenyon, he does this rut report thing, and there was just all these guys that were calling in, and as you listen to more podcasts and you get deeper into this, I guess social media, there is no, there are hunting magazines and stuff like that, but I think this is the new format for the hunting magazine type stuff. Um, I heard this guy, Andy May, and I was like, who is this guy? And so I listened to him, and he's talking about hunting these different things. And it was just these little snippets. And then the more people that we talk to, the name keeps popping up, Andy May, Andy May. And actually, it's funny because it took me about 2 years to get Joe Rentmeester on the podcast. And finally, when I did, he says, why are you talking to me? You need to call guys like Andy May. And we finally got to meet him at the ATA show. We talked to him a little bit with the tethered guys, and then he was at the Novi show with us for one of the days at the tethered booth. We were actually supposed to do this one in person, but the show circuit has been kind of shut down, and that's kind of presented some problems for a few different things. But we got Andy on the line here, fresh back from some turkey scouting. How are you doing today, Andy?
I'm doing good, guys. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, like I say, I appreciate it. Um, you've been on a few different podcasts, and you come very highly regarded. But you're one of those guys that is extremely humble, and you're probably just like Joe in the sense of why do these guys want to talk to me? Why does the listener want to hear from me? But let's go back to like when you started hunting and kind of your style of hunting and how it's progressed over the years.
Okay. Yeah, I got started a little later than most guys do, I guess. I started when I was 18. I didn't have like a dad that got me into it or anything. I had a couple of cousins that were into hunting. They got into it a year before me, and I guess they were kind of the reason that I took interest in it. But I actually started with archery first before hunting, and bought a bow, cheap bear bow, and got in an archery league, and I did quite well. And then everybody at the archery league was like, "Man, you should bow hunt. You should bow hunt." So that was kind of the transition there. And the first year I hunted was, like I said, I was 18, and this I started off just kind of learning on my own. Nobody ever really taught me how to hunt, so I kind of the more people I meet, like in the hunting circle, I think in a lot of ways that was a good thing for me, because I didn't learn any like bad habits from like grandpa and dad. Not to say all dads and grandpas don't hunt right. I mean, but the way I hunt, I guess, is I like to hunt a lot of different areas, and I like to go after the more mature deer. And a lot of my friends that hunt kind of hunt the way their dad and grandpa taught them, and a lot of times it's, I guess, not conducive to big buck hunting. But what I did miss out on was that family aspect of hunting, and the deer camps and that kind of thing, and that part I really do regret. I wish I would have had something like that. So I try to take a few trips, every year with a buddy or two. There's been a few where we've had 4 or 5 guys, and I really enjoy those. But I also do I do a lot of solo stuff too. I kind of like both. I like being on my own and doing my own thing, but then I also like those trips where I have a few close friends, and we kind of work together as a team. But it kind of started there. At 18, I had success the first year. I shot a little spike buck, and the second year I shot 2 does, all with my bow. And then the third year I shot. I got invited out to a family farm, a guy I went to high school with, and it was on a deer drive, and they just basically they put me somewhere just to put me. It wasn't, I don't think they were expecting me to shoot anything, but they kicked a real big buck out of a standing cornfield, and this buck came racing by me, and I put the gun up, and I was kind of tracking and leading him, and I shot and put him down right there, and it ended up being the biggest buck they've ever killed in the history of their 30-year family farm. So it was kind of lucky, but that right there after that buck, I was like kind of hooked on bigger bucks, and that was a nice one, and that was like the third year of hunting, and then I never really went backwards. I kind of got obsessed with those bigger and older deer, and that's kind of set me down that path.
So that's awesome. I haven't heard that story, and
Yeah.
let's start right there. So do you think? I guess what did you think after you shot that big deer? Did you think that that was a pivotal moment in the fact that did send you down that path, obviously, but did you think that it was going to be easy, or did you dive in fully and say, how am I going to do this? Did you make it your life's work to locate big deer? Did you backtrack that and say, where was that deer coming from? Or I mean, I guess because everybody who shoots a big buck, they say, well, I want to do that again. But I mean,
Yeah.
you've obviously taken it to another level and actually done it. So,
Yeah. After I shot that deer, I just kind of, I didn't want to really shoot anything small, and I don't think I ever shot anything, smaller since then. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But I certainly wasn't what I would call a big buck slayer all of a sudden. I mean, I made a ton of mistakes, but I did have that mentality. Like I want to learn more about these older deer and where they are and how they travel, and how to get on them, especially with a bow. I was pretty much. I mean, that was one of my only gun hunts. Up to that point, I was pretty much a bow hunter, and still am to this day. I do very little gun hunting, but um, I think I just started hunting, and it was. I know in my early years, I put in a lot of time. I mean, I was before marriage, before kids, before all of that, and I was hunting um, 6, 7 days a week, and I was scouting even in the off season. I mean, I would scout after work, after school. I mean, at least 5 days a week. I mean, I was completely obsessed with it, and I think I was successful on killing nice deer, especially for Michigan, pretty much from that point on. But it was more so out of like persistence. I think just putting in a lot of time, hunting a lot, hunting nearly every day, and making a ton of mistakes. And then eventually I just crossed paths with a good buck and got it done. But as I got older, um, I guess I had that mentality of wanting to learn and wanting to be better. And I started, you know, reading resources and reaching out to people that were more successful than me and to learn, like a lot of young guys do now. I have people reaching out to me to learn, and that's exactly how I was at the early stages of hunting too. So I totally get where those guys are at, and I try to give any input I can when they ask, because there were guys that took the time and did that for me, early on. So I kind of sought out those guys that seemed to be on the next level of, big buck hunting, and, reached out to guys like Eberhart and, Dan Infault and Miles Keller and, all those guys. And every single one of them, took the time to talk to me a little bit and pick their brain. And I took a little bit from everybody, and then kind of developed my own style, I guess, too. Um, but as I progressed, I became better and I became more efficient, and it wasn't as much about putting as much time in the woods as possible to kill a big buck. It was more about hunting smart and putting in the right time. And then as I got older, full time job, and I had my daughter and married and all that stuff. So things got a lot harder as far as being able to get time out in the woods. But by the time that all happened, I had my daughter. Let's see, I'm 42. She's 11. So I mean, by the time I was 31, I had done nothing but scout and hunt. That was my only thing I did. I didn't do golf leagues. I didn't do softball with the guys. I had a fishing boat that collected dust. It was just like I did that every waking moment. So those early years, from 18 to 31, those were the years that were pivotal in learning and becoming a better hunter. And I just put in that time, and I think I had that mentality of wanting to learn and become better. Um, and then, once I had those other responsibilities, the family responsibilities, that time was reduced. But I just had to learn how to do it in a smarter way, I guess, and a more efficient way, and in a way that it wouldn't take away from, time with my daughter or, the family. So that's kind of how that all progressed. But, one thing that, like I mentioned, is key is just that a lot of years and a lot of time of putting in that obsessive type work. And that really, paved the way to, me being able to spend a little less time in the woods, but still be successful. And I think when you hear guys like John and Dan and Miles and all those guys, they there was a point in their life where they all devoted everything to hunting, like literally everything, and some of them even put it in front of family. And I think that's I'm not saying it's recommended or a good thing, but I think it's a common theme for those guys that seem to be that we believe to be on the next level. You'll see that as a common theme, where they put hunting on a pretty top tier of their life, and put in a lot of time and made a lot of mistakes.
So with the mistakes and the time and those types of things, and you keep talking about efficiency, as you spoke to those next level hunters, as you call them, what was the main takeaways that you had from that? Because what I've learned through this and talking to the same or similar guys and guys like yourself, is that you can, one of the problems that I have or have had is, I might say that I have quote unquote time in the woods, but if I keep doing the same things and go into the same areas, and I can spend as much time as I want to doing the wrong things or hunting the wrong sign. And I think maybe that's one of the things that like that you're talking about, where you didn't develop those bad habits, but from that kind of tipping point, as you were getting those, as you were becoming more efficient, what are some of the key things that you've taken away from that and now tend to focus on?
Yeah, well, one thing with talking with those guys, one thing that was very common across all boards was that it's very important. Scouting is very important, and in most cases, all those guys, myself included, but all those guys that really seem to have hunting figured out and are consistently successful. They scout much more than they actually hunt, and that certainly rings true with me and my style. I'm scouting all the time, in season and out of season, every chance I get. And that allows me to have the same or even more success in season with less time. So that's a big one. And then another thing a lot of those guys had is they have like a certain style or a system that really works for them. The one that they had success on early on, and they just continued to fine tune it and turn it into um, a really like well-oiled machine that can be repeatable year after year. And there's a lot of similarities between those guys, but there's some differences too. Like Miles was he was a travel corridor hunter. He hunted travel routes, and that was his thing. And as we know, Infalt likes to hunt the bedding areas, and then John is more of a primary scrape type guy. And I think there's a lot of overlap there with those guys, but they all had a kind of certain style that they ended up kind of zeroing in on. And I think where I'm a little bit different is that I've been, you know, uh, kind of picking the brains of all these guys for years, but then also trying new things on my own. And I feel like I don't really have a certain style. I feel like I'm a mix of a lot of styles. And I feel pretty confident in a lot of styles that I can go out and be successful. So I like to think that I'm, you know, um, fairly well rounded in a lot of different styles and a lot of different types of habitat and terrain. I'm not saying I think I'm on like that type of level or anything, but I do feel very confident going anywhere and being able to get on nice deer with with enough time. So I think that the biggest takeaways besides what I mentioned with those guys, for me personally, definitely has been scouting more than you can hunt, or more than you hunt, putting in that time scouting and meaningful scouting, like go out scouting with a purpose, not just walking through the woods and pointing out a few rubs and scrapes. I mean, there's a lot more to it than that. There's finding the buck bedding areas for sure. There's finding the travel routes that bucks like to travel. Those primary scrape areas, the rub lines, the transition edges, and then you can get into all the different types of habitats and stuff, which where big deer like to gravitate towards, and then you got to look into different times of the year and how that stuff all shifts. So putting in that time scouting and meaningful scouting, like go out with a goal in mind every time you go out, that you're trying to, maybe you're trying to locate this big buck's track, or you're trying to find, you know, you've got the bed located, but you need this perfect access or to get to this tree that you need to get to. So things like that. Every time I go out, it's with a purpose, and I really try to dial that in. Um, Another thing is intimate knowledge with your hunting areas. Um, Part of the reason I think, um, a huge reason that I'm successful and it appears that I'm efficient is because I'm intimately I have intimate knowledge of a lot of the areas I hunt, and that goes public, private, in state, out of state. I've scouted a lot of these places. I mean, literally like at nauseum. I really have. And if a big buck shows up in a lot of these areas, I have a really um, high confidence that I can get him killed once a big buck is in those certain areas. So being really intimate, and that takes years of experience. It takes some woodsmanship and some knowledge, but more of my more of my intimate knowledge has been built through years of experience and observations and um, writing that stuff down and looking for patterns and seeing what this deer did from year to year, and where do these on a certain piece of ground, where do the big bucks tend to show up, and that sort of thing. So for me, maybe a little bit less knowledge, but more being attentive over a span of time of hunting and scouting an area. So I get really intimate with those areas and I know them really, really well. And if a big buck shows up, I usually know where he's bedding. Um, I know where they like to travel. I know where I can get in. I know where I can get out. Um, and a lot of times I know like the exact location where I'd have the best chance of getting them. And I'm not saying that's all the time, but I have quite a library of these types of areas across several states where I have that confidence, and it just takes time. It just takes time and commitment, and a lot of learning different areas. Like if you get stuck, stuck on like one property or two, you learn that one or two properties, but then you get thrown in a different situation. You feel kind of lost. I have some friends that, they can hunt their home farm awesome, but then you get them out of state or you get them in a different place and they're kind of lost. And not knocking anybody at all. But for me personally, I want to be effective and dangerous wherever I go. And that's always been a goal of mine. So I've always made it a goal to always try hunting new states, new types of habitat, new types of terrain, and stuff that I wasn't good at and stuff that was challenging for me so that I continued to learn. Um, so I think that's a big one too. If that's a goal of any of your listeners to become better hunters, um, to challenge yourself in different areas and different types of habitat and hill country and in open type grassland out west and your Midwest farm country and swamps and marshes and all that stuff. If you learn to hunt and navigate all those types of terrain, then you're dangerous wherever you go. And that might not be everybody's goal. Some people just want to kill big bucks, and you can do that. Buy 50 acres and you can put in your food plots and you get some good neighbors and stuff, and you can have that success. But that's never been a goal of mine. It's more variety, a variety of terrain and a variety of challenges, and constantly challenging myself. So going back to those areas that I mentioned where I know intimately well, that allows me to be efficient in those areas. But then every year I add new stuff. I try to go to a new state. I try to hunt a different type of terrain that I don't feel real confident in hopes that I do learn more and get and become more effective. So I don't know. That's kind of a long-winded way to answer that, but that's kind of some of the takeaways I've learned from other people, some of the takeaways I've learned from myself over the years, and just kind of the way I look at things, as far as like how I hunt, or, I guess that kind of explains that a little bit.
Okay. So can you guys hear
me?
Yeah.
All right. So when you say you're going to go out of state, go to a new spot, what do you utilize the most? I mean, are you using like Onyx or those kind of maps, or are you actually going out of state and getting boots on the ground multiple times throughout the year?
So it really depends on when I'm planning that out of state hunt. So if it's a rut type hunt, which my first out of state hunts, they were all like kind of during the rut. That's when most guys travel, and that's the way I started. And I would always try to go out there in the spring, like, this time of year, February, March, April, sometime in there, before green up, so that I could really get a clear picture of the deer activity before everything got too thick. You can see those rubs, you can see those scrapes, you can find those beds, you can see the travel routes that were well used. And I would walk all that ground. I'd find the pinch point travel routes. I'd find the doe bedding, buck bedding if it was there, and I would literally try to learn that area as much as possible, and even have spots and access dialed in, so that when I came in during the rut, I had plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, all these different spots ready to go, different winds. So I would put in a lot of boots on the ground, and a lot of time. But that was when I was doing like one out of state rut trip, Now I take several out of state trips a year. So it's not always feasible to do that. But if it's a trip during the rut, I do my darndest to get down there and scout in the spring. I think that's a huge advantage if you can do that. Now, if you're hunting a state that's is known to have a lot more, older deer, mature deer, something like an Iowa or Illinois, you can probably get away without doing that and go there and still have a good hunt. I've done that before. But if you're hunting some of those other states where maybe it's a little trickier to get on one, I think that's an important step. But I've started taking trips early season as well for openers, and those types of trips, I do more. I try to go a few days before the season starts, or depending on how far it is. If it's not too far, if it's something like down to Ohio where I can drive a few times to Glass or do something like that, or run some cameras or something, I would try to do that. If it's something more like Kentucky where I hunt, it's like 7 hours away. So I'll go down like two or 3 days before the season, and I'll spend those days scouting, more long range type scouting, glassing. It's farm country. I'm looking for bachelor groups of velvet bucks in bean fields. So really going down there in the spring wouldn't tell me much, because I'm not going to be hunting down there during the rut. I'm going to be there those first few days of the season. So I'm trying to find, the whole goal there is just to try to find a good buck early season on an early season pattern, coming into a food source without a care in the world, and then slip in and kill them. So those, I've killed a few velvet bucks in Kentucky, and that's my strategy going to those. And as far as like resources, like mapping resources, yeah, I'm fanatic about maps. I use Onyx a lot for obviously property lines, private, public landowner, lines and that sort of thing. Every time I go out of state, I always try to knock on some doors. I still try to gain free permission all the time. It's becoming obviously a lot harder, but when I'm not successful, then I'm usually end up on the public, and a lot of times the public is better than the private. So it just depends. But I also use the Google Earth, the actual internet edition. The image is unbelievable. Not the desktop version. You got to go to the online version. And then I also use CalTopo, and that has the best water sources. Like on topo maps, it marks every single water source, something that Onyx and even Google Earth misses. So I utilize all three of those a lot, and sometimes I'll even, if it's a state where I can't hunt or I can't scout prior, I'll have some spots mixed out, and I'll even from home kind of scout out my access and mark it, and and then put it onto my phone or my GPS, so that I get there and I have some plans. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I utilize all those resources.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
In mentioning the water sources and things like that, is there a certain terrain feature that you're looking at, or is the water feature just for access? Or, I mean, when you're going into a place that you haven't set foot on, or as you're going down to scout that first time, like, is there a certain terrain feature or kind of a thing where you're going to go check those first, or is that your preferred area?
It depends on when I'm going down. So down in Kentucky, when there's a year where there's a drought, I have some water sources that I know about that are, they are like the last to lose all the water, and I mean it's almost like a slam dunk. That they're getting hit heavy. So like on certain years like that, those water sources can be huge. And then when it's not a drought, it's not as big of a draw because there's water everywhere and there's water in the vegetation and everything else. So it really depends on the time of the year, depends on the conditions. If I'm hunting during the rut, more times than not, I'm focusing on pinch points, some sort of terrain feature, whether it be like in farm country where timber or cover kind of pinches down and funnels movement, or in hill country where it's more terrain features that kind of direct deer travel. All the stuff that we all know as hunters, I focus on that. But what I do, I guess what I try to do on top of that is I try to go in areas where I know there is a big buck in that area, or a number of good deer. So like when I go out of state, I don't really have like a target animal. I do in Ohio because I'm 10 miles from the border. So I hunt northern Ohio, and there's often a few individual bucks that I'm going after. But anywhere else I go, there's no real target animal. I'm just going to an area that has a lot more nicer animals than here back home in Michigan, and I'm just kind of putting myself in those higher percentage spots. But I will gravitate more towards that big buck sign, or really good doe bedding areas. I like to, during the rut, I really like to get in tight to those, kind of on the downwind side, or travel routes going to and from. So again, a lot of it goes back to areas that I'm familiar with, or that I've scouted so much that I know hold nice deer in certain spots where I know if I got this wind and I got this good access, if I put in time there, I can get a good one there. So it just takes a lot of you got to get after it. You got to go to these places and put in the time. It's hard until you've been at it a long time to go in blind and have success on a short term. Now, most guys can go, if they're a somewhat knowledgeable hunter, can go out of state and give it a week to 10 days and come away with something decent. It's a lot harder to go to those places blind when you have 2 or 3 days, 4 days, which is my average out of state hunt is probably 3 days. I usually have 2 to 4 days. And then, but I can come back often. Like often I'll do that, and then I'll come back home, and then I'll, come back another time if I have to. But once you have, put in that time, I guess that's the prerequisite, that years and years and years of kind of like that obsessive learning. Then you just become better at making the right decision. You become better at going right to areas that look good on the map, and kind of Xing out those areas that don't look like they have potential. And kind of when you come across that right spot, you get that feeling that, this is what I'm looking for, and this is a high percentage spot, and this is a spot I'm going to put in time. Or maybe you find this other spot that looks good, but you're like, well, there's a hunter over here, and this maybe it just doesn't quite have all the features that you might want compared to some of these other spots that you would think are higher percentage. So I find those spots that I have really high confidence in, that I think are really high percentage sits, and those are the ones I focus on. And that's why a lot of times I'm able to tag out in 2 or 3 days, because I find those spots, and I'll walk by a lot of spots that look good, to find those 1 or 2 or 3 great spots.
Another thing with that, those 2 or 3 day hunts, and the success that you have, and I believe it was the podcast that you did with Tethered at ATA, where I think Taylor brought it up. He said, you're probably the most efficient hunter, in the country or whatever. And Taylor likes to talk a lot, but he also kills a lot of deer, and he's around a lot of people, right? So, but what everybody kind of commented on, Carl, I know he had mentioned it to you, was the ability to make the correct move, you locate these deer, you have an encounter, and you say, "This is what I'm going to do tomorrow." That's what the deer is going to do tomorrow, and then you kill them.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about making those adjustments, because I feel like that's one of the things that it definitely comes with time, but I think that that's probably one of the things where people mess up the most is, especially people that are trying to increase their I don't know, hunting skills or up their hunting games, that they have this encounter, right? And then they say, well, hopefully tomorrow that doe will bring them on this over here, or there's a lot more hope than there is action, I think.
Yeah. Um, I've gotten so much crap about that. I called a kill this year, and there was a buck that I had seen do something. The previous year he had done the same thing during this short window in late October, and he had done it the day before, and I was moving in for the kill, and I called it. I basically said, yeah, I'm going to kill this buck tonight. I really didn't know, but I felt very confident in that, and it happened, and now like everybody's just like going crazy about it. But what they don't know is all the times I've felt that and didn't kill anything. So I mean, it just happened to work out that time. But that does come with experience. There's these certain times where I encounter these situations where I feel like I have a really high probability of having an encounter with the deer I'm after. And most time, or sometimes it has to do with observing him do something the day before, and then having similar conditions the next day. In almost all of these, except for one situation, which I'll touch on, is outside of the rut. There's one situation during the rut where you can do that in consecutive days, but these are all situations that kind of like outside of the rut or pre-rut, like early to late October, kind of when deer are doing similar things kind of day to day. They do change patterns, but it's often, they're often on these short little patterns, and that's what you got to capitalize on if you can figure them out and if you can learn those. And if you can see a deer doing something in that time frame, and then you got those similar wind and similar conditions the next day, that gives you an opportunity. At least it gives you something to kind of go on and go after him that following day. I would feel pretty confident in that moving in, and with that sit, I would call that a pretty high percentage sit. But then what I've started seeing is that year to year, after I've been like after a certain buck for a couple of years, I start to see these patterns that they do in different areas, and they're over here in this section here, in late October, and then this buck is over here, hitting this food source, at the beginning of the season, and then he disappears, and then this buck's over here in late October, but before that I had no idea where he's at. So I start to see these little patterns that these bucks show me, like on consecutive years, or I check my cameras or go through my pictures at the end of the year. I was like, man, this buck was all over the place for a 3-day period, so when there's a buck that I'm kind of zeroing in on and I see a pattern like that, then that's when I focus my time in that single area going after that deer. And I wouldn't say the majority of my kills have came from that, but it seems like a lot more have come lately. So that's where that confidence comes in, where, okay, I'm diving in after this buck. Like a few years ago, the big wide 9-point, he's on the wall over there, but I had hunted him for 2 years, and I got some nighttime pictures of him very sporadically, hardly ever. Had no idea where he was bedded, somewhere off where I couldn't hunt. And then it was that late October, like October 24th, 25th, 26th, for 3 years straight, he showed up in daylight. He was just opening up scrapes in this area. And I I noticed it. I noticed the pattern the first year I hunted him when he was 3. I had a visual. I started getting pictures of him, then nothing. And then after the year, I pulled all my cameras. I go through all my cameras and I put them I organize them in a way that is really easy for me to kind of learn from and see those patterns. And then, so the next year I had that in mind. I was like, okay, I virtually had no idea where this deer was, the beginning of season, even mid-October, but that late October timeframe, he became real active. So I was real attentive to that time of year where I was going to start putting in some sits for that deer during that time frame. So the second year, same thing. He showed up. I'd have to go back and look, but it might have been to the day of like October 24th. And it was unreal. He was there starting to open up all these scrapes again. And I was hunting him in an area where he was opening all these scrapes. And this was a mistake I made in a learning experience. I was hunting in an area that it was like kind of an opening in the woods where he was making, 10 or 12 scrapes in this, I don't know, maybe acre opening, had some oak trees, some low hanging limbs. But I was sitting on the downward side of this opening, thinking I had the wind perfect. But what was happening is the wind was coming over the top, coming into that opening and vacuum pushing me back. So I sat there, I don't know, 2 or 3 times during that time frame for that deer. And there was one hunt where I think he was coming in and he winded me, and I was throwing milkweed, and it's like I was so frustrated because it just kept blowing the wrong way. The wind was coming out of the north, but then it was blowing my milkweed back to the north instead of the south because it was kind of swirling down through. So after that season, again, I went through my pictures. He was all over the place during that time frame, and the 24th, 25th, 26th, right in there. And he showed up a few sporadic times, like once like during the rut, and then once again like during Christmas or something. But it was just kind of sporadic. But then, so that off season before the third year, I said, okay, how can I hunt this buck where I can get a consistent wind where I still think he's traveling through? And what happened is it took me way to the edge of this property, almost like basically to a field edge, which I would normally not hunt. But what made this field edge doable was that it was like nearly a mile from the road, and it had standing corn. But what was cool about it was there was this giant point that kind of jutted out into the standing cornfield, and I knew from scouting that was a bedding area for a big buck. Years ago, when I scouted that point, there's a giant bed on there, and I always thought that was one of his beds. So that third year, what I did is I found a spot where he could, if he was bedded in that point, which would, when deer are bedded on a point, what they like to do is they like to have the wind blowing down through the tip of that point. So I waited for a wind that was blowing down the tip of that point. Also, I got in a spot where I could get consistent wind and good access to where I still thought that this deer was traveling kind of to and from that area where he liked to open up those scrapes. A lot of times he was in there like in the morning and a lot of times in the evening. So I backed way off of where all that sign was. And I was in a spot where there was no big buck sign. It was just a hunch that he was traveling through this little pinch. And I was, a good 100 yards, 150 yards from all the sign, the rubs, and all those scrapes that you see. You walk up to that, you're like, man, this is the spot, right? This is where I'm going to kill him. Like, I couldn't hunt there because the wind wasn't, you just can't do it with that wind. So I backed off and I waited. I didn't hunt that area at all the whole entire season. And I waited. I was going to wait till the October 24th, 25th, 26th, somewhere in there. And then I remember the 24th was kind of warm, and I don't remember what the wind was, but I remember it being warm. But then I remember looking at the forecast, and the 25th was like this big drop cold front. And I was like, okay, so now I got the time frame of this buck likes to be in here nailed. I think I know where he can travel through, or where he's traveling through, where I can get a consistent win. And now I got a cold front that's going to get him on his feet even earlier, potentially. So there's a lot of factors in my favor. And I went into that hunt thinking I was going to kill that deer. I didn't know, of course not, but I felt, man, I got a lot of pieces of the puzzle here. Learning, you know, two years of pictures, of sightings, and of trying to figure this property out. And I snuck in there on the 25th. And as I'm walking in along this field edge, keep in mind it's standing corn, so it's like standing corn and then field. But there was all these scrapes lined up, opened up fresh as I'm walking that edge, and I'm like, oh my gosh, man, he's in here. And then a few of them even had a big giant track, like big mature buck track. And I was like, he's here. This is him, because that was the only mature deer in that area. This particular area, like this square mile, is the most ridiculous hunting pressure I've ever hunted. Public, private, does not matter. It was crazy. So many guys. And I think that deer was fairly well known. A lot of guys were after him. So anyway, I walked down that edge and I'm going by these scrapes, but they're field edge scrapes, and I'm not putting too much stock. I want to get to that travel corridor, that pinch where I think he, could potentially travel through. I got up there, sit the whole night, and it's funny because I got a lot of this hunt on video, and I'm videoing after I'm set up, all these other hunters, trucks driving in here, guys walking out here, and another truck driving in here. You see a guy getting out, and I mean, this deer was surrounded. It was crazy. And anyway, it gets to be like kind of prime time, and I'm like glassing that point. I'm not seeing anything, and then all of a sudden I look up, and I feel like I see like legs. I put my binoculars up, and I see legs, and I see this kind of big belly, but I can't see his head. And all of a sudden he comes out. I see him go into the corn, and then he kind of circles back into the woods. And he's big, 24-inch wide, 920 is really impressive. But he circled back in the woods, and he started coming down just the inside of that woods, right towards my spot. And he came right through that funnel like I predicted, and I put the shot on him, and he went down. But that was a really cool hunt, and probably one of the most I'm proud of, because it took a lot of he outsmarted me for a few years, and it took a lot of trial and error and kind of I guess figuring, mentally figuring things out, and I made the right call. But that was it was even before that, but that one really kind of solidified, hey, these deer do have these micro patterns during the year. And if you can find maybe a season or two consecutive seasons where a buck was in a certain small area or did something 2 years in a row, I even count it. If I see it 1 year, then it's on my radar for the next year. But I really started dialing in those little small patterns in those areas, and that's when I hunt those particular deer. And what that does is it just gives me like what I call just a really high percentage sit, because he's already shown where he wants to be. And I'm not saying this is 100%, but it's a pretty high percent. And now, since I've been talking about it, and I'm more attentive and listening and reading, there's a lot of guys that have mentioned this in the past. Like Don Higgins has mentioned it many times. And I don't remember that, but it's kind of, I've seen it since I started thinking about this, and a couple other guys as well. So it's definitely something to key in on, and that gives you that just a really solid plan to go after a certain deer. And it's not just deer. Like, let's say you don't have necessarily a specific buck that you're going after. You can still see these same patterns in just areas in general. So like there's areas that I hunt that, man, they really light up during that first second week of November, maybe that first week of November. There's usually those places are have higher doe numbers. You could hunt there all October and not see a mature buck, and it's just doe family groups and a couple little bucks. But then you go in there that first 2 weeks of November, and it's like boom, you got a really high percentage sit, because you have not been in there mucking anything up. You haven't been diverting the doe traffic. They're in there unpressured, and you slide in right at prime time, right when your chances are the absolute highest of the season, you slip in, and that's when those bucks are moving, and that's when they're really cruising in those areas. So I have a number of spots like that where I slip in one time, maybe two times, and it's like a lot of times that I get it done right in those one or two sits. And then then there's those other spots where they tend to hold a bastard group or a good buck early in the season, like right around the opener. Those are a little bit harder to find, but when you can find those, then you got a handful of spots that are really high percentage sits early in the season. And the same goes for mid-October and late season and everything else. So I try to find these types of areas, these little micro patterns of areas and specific deer that kind of take up my whole season. So I'm not saying I have my season scheduled from start to finish, but I have, going into a season, I kind of have this tentative game plan, or like, okay, I'm really going to focus on this particular buck in this area during this time frame. And then, during the rut, I'm probably going to sit this river bottom that's loaded with does. There's always a few good bucks in the area, and I'm going to put in a few all day sits there. And then, oh yeah, the last 2 years I had this good buck show up late season in this area. So, in December, that's where I'm going to spend some time there in December hunting this buck. And then, what I find is, like, the last several years, like, I have this kind of, like I said, like almost like a tentative plan of the way the season's going to go. But then I throw in my out-of-state trips, and then I also, sometimes none of this stuff pans out, or it's Michigan. So, it seems like at least half the time I get screwed up just by other hunters on the areas that I hunt, or deer get killed or pressure moves them, so then when that stuff happens, then I go more into like scouting mode, or observation stand mode, or like a still hunting mode, where I kind of scout and hunt, on the ground. I'm hunting, but I'm scouting at the same time, and I'm kind of slipping through the cover, like still hunting. And I'll do that sometimes just to I'm always trying to get a bead on a good one. I'm never really sitting and waiting and hoping one comes by. Unless it's one of those things I mentioned earlier where I have really high confidence. If I don't have high confidence, I'm not going to go sit in the stand over here, where I don't know what's there, and just hope. I might go sit over here where I can see a long ways and get 25 feet up, and I can glass a whole river bottom or a swamp or something like that. That's something I would do if I didn't have anything really going on. But I'm never going to just sit and hope blindly. I'm going to go out with a purpose. And then sometimes, like I said, I do that still hunting, kind of slipping through the cover, with my bow. I'm scouting, but I'm also kind of moving towards where I know the deer are, or where I have it. Maybe I have a suspicion that a big buck is bedded, and I'm kind of slowly working towards that as, depending on the time of year. Let's say it's mid-October. This is something I might do mid-October, but I'm working towards where I think, there might be a good buck bedded, but I'm scouting. I'm looking for a sign on the way. And if I see something like, man, this is good here, this is torn up, and there's a rub line, I feel like I'm getting close to this buck, I might set up right there. And then if I don't feel that, if I don't have that high confidence, I keep going and I keep going. And the whole goal is to see that deer before he sees me. And, it's kind of a high risk, high reward type thing, but that's my mentality when I don't have these other things going on. Or when some of these other plans that I have get foiled, a deer gets killed, it gets hit by a car, it gets poached. I mean, it's all happened to me, or high pressure moves into the area, and everything is kind of busted up. So I'm always trying to find that high percentage sit. And I hope that kind of all makes sense. I know I rambled there, but it's never just sitting and hoping. It's always, I'm looking for that really high percentage, high confidence type setup. And if I don't have it planned, if I don't have it, with my historical data, or a buck I'm after, then I go out looking for it very aggressively. And I don't know, by hunting this way and having that kind of approach, I feel like I'm in the game constantly. I'm in the game. I'm playing cat and mouse with a buck all season. Like I'm always on to something, and if I'm not, I'm doing this aggressive approach to get onto something. So I don't know. That's just the way. That's just the way I kind of look at it and the way I tackle a season in general. So I don't know if that answers your question. Sorry, I talked so long.
No, I mean, there's a lot of takeaways from that, just in the sense of not taking everything at face value, but saying, okay, why, when, that tended to be kind of like what I took away from that is the when is why are they there at that time, and over time. And actually, the biggest buck that I've ever killed was a deer that John saw the year before to the day, and read an article and said you need to be in that same stand. There's a good probability, and we went down there and killed him. But so how are you organizing all of that information? Because there's a lot that you had said there, but there's a lot of guys that take notes and but that sounds like a library of composition notebooks of, okay, my October, this.
Yeah. So, well, I've had a hunting journal since 1998. Every hunt, where I hunted, AM or PM, what the weather was like, where I sat, what the wind was doing. The only thing I put moon phase on there. The only thing I didn't put, which I really regret, was the barometric pressure. But I did that. I've done that every single hunt that I've ever done since 1998. So that gives me a nice database to go back. There's been many times where I just was like, all right, I took the whole day and I went back and went through and tried to find patterns. And I was like, okay, this was good here this year. This area really, I had some really good sits here. I saw some good deer over here that year. And that was kind of the start of it. And then, I don't know, maybe like 8 or 9 years ago, what I started doing was I started on maps and even on notebook paper, like I started writing down like when I had a sighting of a big buck in an area, or an individual buck. And then when I would go through my trail camera data, I would jot that down. So then I started seeing, like, for instance, that buck I was talking about, it was October 24th, the 25th, the 26th, everything fell in that window. And then my Michigan buck from this year, same thing. I mean, the last year he was 3. I shot him here this year at 4. And that late October time frame, that was another one that I killed in late October. That's a great time if you can get on an individual buck. Probably that might be my favorite. I think early season's my favorite, but late October, man, if you can get on an individual deer during that time frame, that's a great time to get them. But so I started writing down, like, these dates. Let me see. Hold on. I don't know if this is it or not, actually. Yeah. Okay, so here's an example. So like 2018, 10:22 in the PM, 11:06 in the AM at the scrape, 10:31 AM at the scrape, 11:03 in the PM, 11:12 PM at the scrape, 11:21 PM at the scrape, 11:24 PM at the scrape. That's one buck that I either had sightings or trail cam pictures. So that's a deer that I'm going after. That was from 2018, and then I have just as many data points for 2019. So what I write those down, and then what I'm trying to do is like, okay, when was he in this area the most often, or when was he most vulnerable in this area? And I'm looking for those patterns. So I start writing them down like that. Like that one's about an in particular buck, but I'll do the same thing just in areas. Like there's this, like there's a swamp in this public piece that I hunt, and I call it the, I won't say the name, but the blah blah swamp, swamp. But anyway, but I have the same type of notes from that area. So it's not necessarily an individual buck, but it's when I've had encounters or pictures of good deer in that area. So and I'm always trying to find these little patterns and these clues over time, these like data points, and then it gives me something to kind of focus and capitalize on. And it doesn't always work out, and it doesn't always show a pattern, but I mean, like you guys experienced, and I have many times now, bucks really do kind of hone in on certain areas and do the same things from year to year. And sometimes that can change a little bit, especially if if they're like a subordinate buck and the big mature buck in the area gets killed, there can be a little bit of a shift there and some things can change. But man, I know a lot of what I consider really, really good, knowledgeable hunters, guys that are not, not like social media guys or anything. And I've had these conversations and they have seen it too. And it's really, really something that you should key in on if you're really serious about going after mature deer. This should be a tactic that you pay attention to. If nothing else, it gives you that short window time frame of when you can go after that certain deer or tackle that certain area. And as we all know, I've wrote articles about it. I've said it many times. Like you're my best chance, your best chance, everybody's best chance at that mature buck is that first time in. And yeah, you still got a decent chance in that same spot, maybe the second time if you don't get busted. But I mean, it drops down dramatically every time you sit that same area. So that's what I kind of zero in on a lot of those things I talked about to be more efficient with my time and my sits. And I try to plan a lot of first time sits, or maybe 1, 2, or 3 sits in an area, and then if I don't have them killed by then, it's usually the gig is up and I have to come at them from a different angle or a different area or move on to a different area or deer altogether.
And so with the efficiency thing, you've talked about a couple of guys with a couple of really opposing styles in they're similar but not. John Eberhart is obviously a saddle hunter, super scent control. Dan Infalt, no scent control whatsoever. Doesn't really care for saddles. Both pretty. I mean, I don't know. John is definitely a killer, and he's killed a ton of deer. But the way that he does it with his scent control, I wouldn't say is the most efficient. I mean, that's a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of energy spent. What are you using in terms of equipment for, and how has that evolution gone?
Well, as far as like the scent control thing, I'll touch on that. Like I'm not going to say, what John does, he takes it to another level, and I've never taken it to that level, so I'm not even going to give an opinion on if it's effective or not. I've never had that type of discipline in that area to even test it out. But I probably fall somewhere in the middle of those guys. You know what I mean? Like I like to shower, and be clean. I try to take good care of my boots. I don't like getting sun on my boots, but I feel like, if a deer gets downwind to me, he's probably going to smell me. Even though I wash my stuff, but I'm not spraying down, and I'm not like crazy fanatical about it. There was a point where I was more so, but for the most part, I wash my stuff, keep it in a tote, wash with scent-free soap, that sort of thing. But sometimes I leave work and I don't even really get to do that. So I don't really worry about it all that much. I try to just kind of play the wind and try to be smart like that. But I think you can probably reduce your footprint somewhat if you're using the rubber boots and keep those clean and keep them stored away and that sort of thing. You could probably, I think, I think that can probably help you out a little bit as far as like reducing your scent footprint and maybe beating a deer's nose where you walked a little bit. But that's about as far as I take it. And sometimes I don't even wear my rubber boots. Sometimes I wear my hikers, especially if I'm in a state where I'm hiking back in a mile. I'm not wearing those rubber boots. So as far as other equipment, from very early on, like my third year hunting, fourth year hunting, back in, it would have been like 2000, 2001, right in there. I was, believe it or not, really a mobile hunter. Like I said, I never was taught to like, okay, here's your stand and here's your corn pile. And, we sit here all season. I never really hunted like that. And I hung some stands in some permanent stands, hang on stands. But I had this like cheap, heavy, I don't know, steel lock on or hang on stand that had the chain. And that was like my run and gun setup. And I would, from that early on, not learning from anyone else, just kind of what made sense in my head, I would hang it and I'd hunt and I'd see deer do something. And then I would move the next day over to where I saw the deer do something. And that's just the way I hunted from the get-go. And at the time, I didn't even know that was a style or anything. It just made sense to me. Like, okay, if I'm sitting and I see, a nice 8-point over there, I'm going to go move over there. And that just made sense. I'm going to go to where I saw those deer, I'm going to try to set up where I saw those deer do what they did. And I never really sat in one spot over and over and over. That was never my style. So back then with that heavy stand, that chain, it was so noisy, man. I remember I had that whole thing like wrapped in like electrical tape and duct tape. And it was like, every time I'd be hanging it and like clink, like, damn it. And it would screw me up so many times. I had that whole thing just taped up and it was like, it had to weigh over 20 pounds. It was crazy. But that's the way it was for the longest time. And then, then I got into like the lone wolf stands and stuff. And that was huge, huge game changer there for sure. Use that forever and still have a couple, and we'll continue to use them when the situation's right for sure. And right around 2008, 2009 is when I got my first saddle. And I was all about reducing bulk and weight. I was a mobile hunter from the beginning. I liked the idea of being sleek and fast and light and adjusting on the fly. And so I saw the advantages, at least in my mind, of the saddle. But the saddle I had was a big, bulky, heavy thing. At the time, I believe it was the only one out there, or one of maybe two. And I just didn't love it. You know what I mean? I wasn't that comfortable in it, but I toughed it out for a few years. I killed some deer out of it. But I slowly started kind of going back to the light hang on and sticks. And so I used that for a lot of years. Not knocking it. It gets the job done for sure. And it's all personal preference. But then these new saddle companies started coming out. And of course, my ears perked up and I became interested and tried out, as you guys know, the tethered products. And man, it was just night and day difference from what I started out with. It was just so much lighter. It was more comfortable and it was just so much more well thought out. And it just fits my style really well. Because I don't know, I hunt from the ground a lot. I don't know if I'm going to be on the ground. I don't know if I'm going to be 30 foot up in the tree, but I like to have everything I need to be able to do both. I don't like to be hunting on the ground when I have a stand and sticks on my back and I have to stash those somewhere and then, go back and get them, or I'm trying to sneak through cover. Like I like to be sleek and fast and light. And just that reduced footprint and that bulk is just, to me, just fits my style well. And I see why some guys prefer the saddle. I think it does have some advantages. I see why some guys choose to stick with a hang on. I totally get it. It's not for everybody, but it does fit my style. But I definitely, I think there's times for both, and I use both. Last year I don't think I used a hang on at all. I think I sat in one permanent stand, and then I was either on the ground or in the saddle. But the year prior to that, I was probably like 70% saddle and 30%, out of my lone wolf. So it just depends. But that's, as far as equipment goes, I mean, if that's kind of what you're wondering, as far as like the stand or saddle type setup, that's kind of where I'm at right now with that.
What are you using to get up the tree?
Say, what kind of climbing system are you using?
So pretty much all last year, I used the Hawk heliums that I just cut down. I cut them to 22 inches. I had a movable aider that I used. So I'd use 3 or 4 of those with that movable aider, and that could get me. I mean, I hunt some really weird setups out of saddle. Like, I'll often hunt like this high off the ground, and just hide behind the tree. But then with those same sticks, and that movable aider, I can get to 25 plus. So that's usually what I use. It's like the kind of public land legal setup. If I'm on a spot that's private, I actually prefer not to have the sticks, because the sticks are bulky and they're heavy. I prefer just a little pouch of those Cranford screw-in steps. I'm really confident and I'm really fast with those. The downside is they're screw-in steps, which I'm not a huge fan of. But on private pieces, if I'm running and gunning and I'm trying to go in light with no bulk, that'd probably be my first choice, because I can just put them in a little pouch and I can just put it right on the saddle or like on my waist belt or something, and go right up the tree. So that's kind of where I'm at right now with the climbing method. But that's something that the wheels are always turning, but I kind of leave that to like Greg and those guys to figure out cool stuff, because those guys are way smarter than me, and I just kind of ride their coattails with that kind of stuff.
So do you use a platform?
Yeah, the Predator platform. Yeah, that thing's awesome. So back when I started saddle hunting, I just did the ring of steps, and it's just that's what John Eberhart used, and that's kind of the guy, I guess, that I'm sure it was him. Yeah, it was him that turned me on to saddle hunting in the first place. So that's what I used, and I think that was a big part of, for me personally, why I didn't have a lot of comfort. Your feet are kind of on the side of the tree, which opens up your thighs, which gave me a lot of hip pinch on the outside of my hips, and just that saddle in general kind of wasn't the most comfortable. But that Predator platform, that for me personally, man, made a big difference in comfort. So now I'm able to sit, with that new saddle, with the Predator platform, I'm able to sit all day, and which is a big thing for me, because I was, out of all those tethered guys, like, I was one of the guys that really struggled to get comfortable. Like, everybody else could kind of make anything work. Like, I couldn't. I got a really bad back. I got some hip problems and stuff. It's stuff that I keep managed through a lot of stretching and core work and stuff. But sitting all day, it's never a treat for anyone. But for me personally, it's kind of grueling pain-wise. But this setup has allowed me to do that pretty darn comfortably, and I'm not really suffering through it. It's more the mental suffering than the physical suffering.
Yeah, it sounds just about like John's scenario.
Yeah. Bad back and bad hip.
Yeah, that'll do it. Makes it tough.
Yeah, so, for sure.
So what are you shooting for your bow setup? And I know I sent it to you, and you've done some videos on target panic and stuff like that. So are you when you're hunting with your hunting setup, are you using a tension release or hinge, or what are you using for your whole setup?
Yeah. So I have a couple. I have a couple bows. I have two Matthews bows. I have a recurve. Um, I always try to have a backup. I like archery. So as much as I love hunting, I love archery just as much. I love the tuning, and I love the just trying to improve in archery. That's kind of like my retreat. Not only do I like shoot to become a better bow hunter, but I just shoot because I love it, and I love trying to become a better archer. So I'm really into like bows and tuning and trying to find that most forgiving and accurate setup. But right now I have two Matthews bows. I have a Traverse, which is a little bit longer axle to axle, and then I have that Vertex, which is a little bit shorter one. And they complement each other well because I shoot them both really good. One, the Traverse, it just kind of fits my draw length. I'm close to a 30-inch draw, so it, you know, with that bow, I feel like a sniper. Like that's my out west bow, my whitetail bow, the majority of the time, and then I go to the Vertex more like when I went elk hunting and I was up in the mountains and hiking a lot. I used the Vertex, a little more maneuverable. But when I was out like in Wyoming chasing antelope or mule deer in Nebraska or Wyoming, then I use that Traverse just because I'm just so accurate with it. So they each have their place, and I don't think any listener needs two bows. It's just me, and I love archery. So that's one of the things that I probably splurge on a little bit more than uh, maybe I should or most guys should is the archery stuff, and I kind of geek out about it. Um, but yeah, so I got those two bows, and then I shoot. I don't know. Your listeners probably don't know, but I suffered from target panic really bad um, many years ago, and man, it was. I was always a really good archer. The first year I picked up a bow, I got an archery league down at Shoepeck Sporting Goods, and I won. I got first place, and I got first place every single year I went down there. Um, but I was a trigger puncher, and whew, I was like, I could barely hold it together, but somehow, I would find the middle. But man, I just remember all those years, like I was really, really fighting that impulse to, do that drive-by shooting and that trigger punching. And I never was in control, even though it appeared so on the scorecard. Like I was never really in control of my shot. And then it really reached a really bad level. One year during hunting, I think I missed two big bucks, and I wounded another, and it was all target panic related. Just literally, I couldn't hold the pin on target, and I saw brown, and I just hammered the trigger, and it was like where I was mentally. I was having anxiety about it, and it was just making it worse. And then I would shoot more, like I felt like I just needed to practice to get rid of it or get past it, and I just kept compounding the issue because I didn't really know the proper way to shoot a bow, and I didn't know what an unanticipated release was. And unless you're in like the target archery world or 3D world, a lot of hunters don't know that. But learning that, I reached out to some archers that were more knowledgeable than me, and again, I sought, just like hunting, I sought out those guys that were the best in the world, and some of them reached out to me and helped me through it, and I learned a lot, and I learned the proper way to shoot, and I learned to shoot with an unanticipated release to beat that target panic. And I put in months and months of just pounding the target in my living room, just for a couple hours every night, and finally beat it. I started using more of a back tension style shot execution, use a thumb trigger. At the time when I made the switch, I switched to a hinge. So that's kind of the way I taught myself that unanticipated release. Then I ended up going to a thumb trigger. I just liked it a little more for hunting purposes. But what that did was not only did it make me a better archer, but it really, it really made me a more effective and accurate shooter on deer, on animals. Before, my nerves and my anxiety about the shot, I would kind of rush. More times than not, I found myself almost not even remembering the shot before all this. Like I just was like, man, I don't know what position he was in, or I don't even know where I hit him, or man, it happened so fast, I don't even know. Like I found myself saying that a lot, but now I have a much more calmer approach to shooting. At my shot execution focuses on the process instead of what's at stake. So now I'm running through this shot execution, and what it does is it gives me this really low kind of anxiety level of shooting, and a much more accurate, a much more forgiving, and I just focus on that execution rather than that big buck standing 25 yards away. And man, it just now. I'm not saying I don't ever make a mistake or miss or anything, but more times than not, I'm putting it on the money, and it just feels good because now I know if I can make a good shot here, I can live with whatever happens. Like I did my part, I executed a good shot, I didn't rush it, I waited for a good angle, I executed, and more times than not, it works out for me. But they are deer, they are wild animals, they move and things happen. But before, I was screwing up here at the shot execution. I was causing my own failure here. And now it's different. I'm executing a good shot. I'm performing here the way I need to. And then the arrow's going where it needs to be. And like I said, more times than not, it's been a positive outcome. So I don't know. There's probably some listeners out there that might be struggling with target panic. It's super common. A lot of people call it buck fever. That's target panic. So, definitely, if that's you, if you're listening to this, that sounds familiar. There's some resources out there that you could check out that could help you. But it certainly helped me, and it took my confidence in my archery to a whole nother level.
Yeah, that's where Adam's at right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's. I
told him because he left the wrist strap release, and then he ended up buying a Carter roll and knocked to it.
Yeah.
And so, but I'm like, dude, I'm watching you, and your thumb isn't on the barrel, and you're just punching it.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's target panic. I'm like, you need to just put that one down for now and get a silverback, which is an actual back tension. You take your finger off the safety, and you pull, and it breaks at a certain poundage.
Yep.
And trust me, I went through the same thing. I did the same process. I bought a Carter, 3-finger the wise choice, because I couldn't get a knock to it, and it was great until I could not keep my thumb from punching it.
Yeah.
I wasn't executing it correctly. So
that's some good advice. Those tension releases are really nice for training that movement and ingraining that kind of pull through motion into your shot. I learned on a hinge, which is a little different. A hinge fires on rotation, but same sort of things. You draw back and you anchor, and then you can pull through on a hinge and make it go, but it also goes just kind of on relaxation. So what I would do is I would just let my pin float and then just kind of relax my hand, and it would go off. And the key to unanticipated release is that you don't know the split second when it's going to fire. So all you can really focus on is, executing your shot. And you just you're staring at the spot. So your aiming is kind of subconscious. Pin's kind of moving around, which is fine. You just let that pin kind of float around, and then you just execute the shot, pull, 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 pull until it goes. And if you could just focus on that pull through motion or on that execution, and just let the pin just stare at the spot you want to hit and let that pin move around a little bit. That's perfectly normal. What most guys try to do is that pin movement freaks them out, and they feel like they need to, their pin's on the target and then it's off, and then it's on and then it's off. So what they try to do is they try to time it as it's passing by, and that's a complete wrong way to shoot. You just stare at that spot and just let that pin float around. As long as your eyes are on the spot you want to hit, what the pin does is it constantly centers itself. It constantly comes back to center. So you're letting your aiming be subconscious, and you're focusing on just pull, gradual pull, build tension, build tension, build tension, build tension, boom. And the arrow goes right to where your pin was floating. So if your pin's floating, let's say you're shooting at a circle like this, and your pin's going here, kind of around the circle, maybe just outside of the circle a little bit. That's okay, because it's always coming back to center. It's just something your brain does. Just like you've heard guys say it, but you drive a car, you're staring down the road, you're not thinking, okay, left, right, left. You just stare, and you're subconscious. You just stay right in the middle. Same thing with aiming your bow. You just let that pin float, and floating is good. Just learn to love that float and accept it, and then run that execution separate. Just pull, 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 and slowly build enough tension till it trips that trigger. And that's the surprise release. And some guys might say, well, in hunting scenario, I don't want a surprise release. That I need it to go now. What I feel like, and this is just my opinion, once you ingrain that shot execution of pull, 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 I can make it go quick. I can make it go slow, and my point of impact is the same. So if I got a deer, chasing a doe through, and I'm, man, like that, get it to stop, and I got to make it go pretty quick, I just pull a little more aggressively into that wall. So I'm pull, pull, boom, and it goes. I mean, it's just it's a second. Right. Whereas if, I'm out like out west, that muley right behind me in Wyoming a few years ago, that was a 60 yard shot, really steep angle. He was feeding, had no idea I was there. I came up over the mountain, and I drew back, and it was one of those things where it was like, I had the time. It was a long shot. I needed to make it count. So I just came back to anchor and letting that pin float in his vitals, no rush. And then I kind of let it, I see that pin settle down slightly, and then I just slowly, gradually build pressure, boom, sends that arrow and just hits the mark. So there's times where, I run it more kind of slow, a slower execution, and there's times where you do got to speed it up. But what you need to do before any of that is possible is you gotta ingrain that execution into your subconscious. It needs to be automatic, and you have to practice that, hundreds and thousands of reps, so that this or this is no longer your vocabulary. You forget it. You just throw that out the window. You never use it again. So if you're struggling with target panic, that's how you beat it. If you're not struggling with target panic, there's some guys out there that shoot an index figure release, and they are what we call a command style shooter. They get the pin on the target, and then they hit the trigger, punch it. Some guys do that, and they never develop target panic. But I think the consensus is from a lot of the archery coaches, the majority of people that do that end up developing some form of target panic. And some people never get over it, and they fight it their whole life. And then other guys go kind of the route that we went and have to do something like this to beat it. But this is the correct way. If all of us got an archery coach when we were 9, this is the way they would have taught us to shoot. You know what I mean? Like, we went to an archery shop, and they gave us a bow, and they gave us that true fire release and say, put the pin on the target and squeeze the trigger. I mean, that's the way they teach everybody. And unfortunately, that leads to target panic down the road.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's John's wheelhouse. So, I mean, before I knew what target panic was, John was giving me talks about target panic and saying, no, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do this. And then you get a podcast, you talk to somebody, you talk about target panic, then boom, it's like the virus. You got it. And now and now you know what it is, and now it's like, okay, well, oh geez, and you're exactly right, that all that anxiety, all that the everything. Last year, the Total Archery Challenge, our listeners have heard this, but it was the worst experience of my life. That last day, I couldn't hit a deer at 30 yards, let alone a bison at 80. It was It was awful, and it was
Yeah.
like didn't matter how many arrows. It was the drive by of drive bys. It was just terrible.
Yeah, that's a bad place to be. And I was right there, man. That year where it peaked, that's how I was. I couldn't even draw my bow back. I mean, I couldn't even draw my bow back without hitting the trigger. There didn't even have to be a target down there. I just send one. Like, who knows where it went? You know what I mean? It was that bad. It was like crazy. So you're doing the right thing. What you need to remember though is you got to commit to this 100%, because if you do it 80%, but then you 20% of the time you still, command style, eventually that's going to catch you back up to you, and you'll kind of fall back into it. So what I told myself was like, never again am I going to squeeze the trigger.
Right.
For me personally, I just was like, never again. I just like, like a guy that's going to quit drinking forever, just stop that day and never do it again. And that's what I told myself. And since then I've never done it, and I've never had any like setbacks or anything. So that resistant release is a really good trainer, and like Mark Kenyon even hunts with his, and a couple guys do. Um, and the hinges are nice too. I spent a whole season hunting with a hinge, and every animal I shot, I think I heart shot every single deer I shot that year with that. I mean, it was just, to this day I still have a hinge, and I probably shoot that the best. But what I didn't like, when with practicing with it, sometimes like on severe angles, which you often find yourself in a tree stand, even though you try to keep that perfect T form and do this, well, what happens is your hand position changes slightly. So it kind of changed the speed of the hinge a little bit, the way it or the way it fired. So I kind of gravitated back towards the thumb button for hunting, but I execute it the same way. I just pull until it goes. So I
Yeah,
think
it's
you're on
like
the right track.
that's why I told Adam, I'm like, dude, you got to, once in a while he'd have a perfect shot, but that that barrel's there, and it's just like it's not going, because I went through the same thing. It's like it's not going, it's not going. Oh, I got to make it go.
Yep.
And like put that one away and get the I told me to get the silverback. I have a hinge too. I shoot my hinge 99% of the time now,
Yeah.
unless I'm hunting. Then I go back to my thumb trigger. But I did what Bomar did and took the barrel off. So now I just have the lever, and I shoot that pretty much like a hinge. I just put my thumb right on the frame,
Yep.
and then I just rotate through.
Yep.
And that's how I shot my turkey yesterday. And it was like I was holding on that bird for, it felt like forever.
On the video, it's a long, long, long time.
Because I'm like, there was actually 3 birds in there, and I'm like, is it the middle one? I got a shot on him. Nope, it's the one on the right. But then when I, like, at that point where I'm like, I know, all right, I got my shot. So then I just sat there and just let the pin flow. I was just looking right at his neck and just pulled, and it, went off.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could dive a little deeper into it. There's actually different ways to kind of execute the shot with the goal in mind of an unanticipated release. There's a relaxation method where you kind of hold more static, and then you just start to relax your hand. And what it does is your release, you're basically lightening up your hand or relaxing your hand, and it's kind of letting the release go forward into your thumb instead of aggressively pulling through. But I think as a hunter, I don't know. I'm no archery coach or expert, but I feel like that pull through motion is a little more, maybe a little more. It gives you a little bit stronger shot, a little more repeatable too. Like in a hunting situation where, you got that deer there and you're staring at that spot, and you're kind of building tension rather than, in a when you got a big buck there, it's kind of hard to release because you got the adrenaline or relax. I mean, so you got adrenaline going and everything else. And I've killed a few deer like that, trying it, just kind of relaxing the hand, and it works. But I keep going back to that strong kind of pull through motion. And just, I feel like when I have that more that strong shot, that aggressive kind of expansion, that I just tend to shoot a little more consistently, and I don't know. It's worked out well for me, and it seems like guys like Dudley and those guys, a lot of his teachings have really helped me. 4 or 5 years ago when I was kind of learning this new method, but it seems like he kind of feels that same way. So I think you're on the right track.
Yeah, yeah. I I need it, but I've started using that silverback, and it's definitely a different thing. And like I had said on a previous podcast, like when I was at ATA, there's no sights or anything on those bows, so it was easy to make a good shot because there was nothing to focus on. There was nothing to be afraid of, I guess, in that regard. But put a sight on the bow and then start trying to shoot at spots and stuff like that, and you get that drive by, that frustration, and then the way that we didn't shoot we shot in a one arrow league, so it was 15 minutes later another one, and you make a bad shot, and now you got 15 minutes to dwell on it, and then you get up to the line again, and it's like, oh, and so this is definitely helped. It's a whole new world because I can see with that silverback and that tension, wanting to make it go off. And sometimes I let my thumb off and it goes off. And then other times I do a good job and pull through. And then other times, like it's just not going. And it's like, come on. And then that arrow's, wasted.
I've heard that's been, I guess, if there has been any criticism with that type of resistant release, that's kind of what I've heard from a few guys is, depending on how hard you're pulling into the wall initially, when you take your finger off that safety, you got to be consistent with that. And sometimes you're in a high pressure situation, you're pulling a little harder than normal. When you get back here, you take your finger off and boom, there it goes. And another thing too is like that front shoulder, like, me personally, like there's a lot of times like when I start shooting bad, I'm getting a little weak in this front shoulders, and there's like a little bit of movement there that can totally change the way that resistant release feels. If it's back a little like this, that's when you're feeling like, oh my gosh, like I'm pulling, because essentially you just kind of like shifted everything back, or maybe you got a real strong front shoulder and you're really kind of holding it out there like this, and then it's that tension, that initial tension is already like past the threshold, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So you really got to get consistent. It definitely teaches really good form and getting those shoulders even and everything else. But yeah, I had the Carter Revolution for a while, and I ran into that a little bit. But again, like I kind of gravitated back towards the hinge and then the thumb. But I think if you stick with that, if nothing else as a trainer, maybe you choose not to hunt with it down the road, or maybe you do, but if you just kind of pound those arrows with that, it forces you to pull through. That's a great way to just ingrain that shot execution. And one thing too, I'll mention too, if like, if you're aiming and your pin's kind of moving around and like you're starting your process and then you stop and you're starting and then you stop, that's target panic. Like every time if you're kind of starting your pull through and then the pin's over here and then you're stopping and then it's coming back and then you start pulling and then you stop, that's bad. Like don't do that. That's target panic right there. Instead, just stare at this spot and kind of almost, you don't even have to really worry about what your pin's doing. It's going to just do this, but it's always going to kind of keep circling back around. And you just pull through, focus. Your mental focus should be, say something like, pull, or, something like that is giving you the focus to just kind of build that tension and pull. I usually go pull until it goes. But that pin can move all around. If you're getting really erratic pin movement, that tends to increase anxiety. That can be sometimes minimized with like different stabilization and stuff. And that's kind of the stuff that I've toyed around with, is different stabilizer weights and balancing my bow so that it creates more of a slow, calm type pin movement. So that might be something, down the road to look into more if you haven't already. That gives you a little more calmer sight picture. Then it's easier to just kind of pull. If you got a real erratic pin, it's like, oh my God, like, Jesus, how am I going to hit this thing? Even though if just executed right, it'd still go where you want it to go. But that erratic pin movement creates anxiety because we feel everybody wants to just hold that pin like boom, perfectly still in the middle, and it just doesn't happen, so.
That's one of the things I just noticed this the other day. I built some strings for Adam's bow and got it all tuned up finally. But he's shooting the Diamond Deploy, the carbon bow, and that thing. I mean, it's awesome because it's so light, but it's so light and so small that when I was, tuning it in, that bow is all over the place for me. I mean, it was a little bit windy that day, so it's like definitely like when you go to an aluminum riser bow or you put some weight on that, it'll stabilize it some more.
And just from shooting a lot, like I look at my hunting bow, I tackle it like a competitive archer. Like I'm trying to build the most accurate setup. And like all this time of year, like all spring and summer, I mean, I'm so archery focused. I'm trying to maximize my forgiveness and my accuracy. And I'll shoot, I'll do a lot of tuning. I'll do a lot of arrow building and different setups. And I'm testing them against each other to find the most accurate setup so that when I go into hunting season, I got a really confident setup. And for me personally, from trying a lot of different bows and messing around with different people's bows and tuning different bows, I shoot a heavier bow much better than a light bow. I see the benefits of a light bow, especially like in the mountains out west. Maybe even if you're just kind of like a 25 yard and in guy or something like that. But just for me personally, I definitely shoot a heavier bow a little better. Not saying everybody will. Some people use or shoot a heavier bow with like high mass weight, and what it does is like they're constantly fighting their pins dropping and dropping and dropping like that. So, you got to add like counterweight to help with that. But I don't know. For me personally, I really struggle with a really light bow to get a calm sight picture, and I like a calm sight picture, even though I can still shoot fine with more of an erratic pin. For me personally, it's a little tougher to do.
Well, I mean, that's something that's never even entered my mind as far as that sort of thing. I feel like it's been like a kind of a deep dive into that because it's like really opened up like me thinking about the way that I shoot and the scenarios in which like that arises. Like I'm not necessarily sure that happens, but I'm not sure that it's not happening either. It's I have a shot process, but nowhere in that process do I say, "Man, how fast is that pin moving?" or anything like that. You're thinking about mechanics. Shoulder up. Where's my feet? What's going on, and then
drive by.
Yeah. Then like
you shouldn't be worried. When you're shooting, you shouldn't be worried about what your pin's doing, really.
Right.
But what I'm talking about, like I will go out and have practice sessions to like analyze or improve my pin flow. So, when I'm doing that, I'm not really working on shot execution. I'm looking at my pin and I'm seeing what it's doing. Do I like my pin flow? Is there something I can do to improve my pin flow? Now, there's nothing wrong with a carbon bow. Absolutely not. It's light. What's cool about that is you can add weight to it in stabilization. And stabilization can, I don't know what you use, but stabilization can slow down your pin movement. So, like if you are getting a little more pin movement than you want, you can start experimenting. If you put like a minimum like 8, 10, 12 inch stabilizer, something like that, put a few ounces out at the end. And what that does is that slows, if you're getting a lot of this, it slows it down. It's just like holding a golf club, with the heavy head out at the end and you got the handle here and you try to wiggle it. It's like, it's slow. And then if you switch it around and you got the head and the handles out there, you can whip it back and forth like this. The same type of deal. You're getting weight out away from the bow, and it can slow this. It can slow this down to like this, you know. But then if you get too much weight out front, then your pin starts doing this and dropping here and dropping. So and then you either got to back off, take a little weight off, or in my case, I use a back bar, so I start adding a little weight to the back. If I'm getting a pin that's dropping a little bit constantly, and that seems to be my issue, you know, the majority of the time, like when I'm setting a bow up, I add a little weight in the back until my pin doesn't drop anymore. Now it's just kind of doing this, really calm, still moving, but it's just a really calm float. I got it stabilized perfectly so it doesn't want to drop. I got enough weight out front where it's not doing this. I don't got too much weight in the back where it wants to go up. You know, I tinker with that until I get that perfect kind of acceptable pin float. And that might be overkill for a lot of hunters, because a lot of hunters are, you know, they're thinking 25 yards and in, and it probably is unnecessary. I'm not trying to get your listeners to do what I do. Like, it's overkill, you know, I would say. But, you know, if you're going to try to take your archery to the next level, and you're looking for, hey, you know, maybe I don't want to kill a deer at 50, but I'd like to be able to practice at 50, and I'd like to be able to hit the bullseye, you know. These are the types of things when you start to get those longer ranges, 50, 60, 80, 100, like at the Total Archery Challenge. These are the things that make all the difference in the world. And that's why, like, you know, this buck here in my antelope, you know, I was able to make a longer shot because I have a setup that's really well balanced. I'm executing a good shot. It's a setup that's really forgiving and accurate that I have a lot of confidence in. If I just took a bare bow out there, I mean, there's no way, you know what I mean? There's no way I'd be able to do some of that stuff. So it just depends on how far down that rabbit hole you want to go. It's definitely, I mean, I know just straight up killers that don't use a stabilizer, that don't shoot past 20 yards. I mean, Eberhardt's like 20 and in, you know what I mean? So this is just the way I do it, and I'm not telling anyone else they should do it this way. It's just, I enjoy it, and I think that's why I go so far down that rabbit hole. And for me personally, I've seen an increase in performance and in success, and then in shot opportunities, because when the conditions are right, I am able to reach out there a little further.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm on the same, you know, pattern you are with that. And it's, some of our listeners are too. I mean, we just had a Zoom meeting with some of our Patreons, and I was saying like the same exact things that we're talking about right now, like the whole thing with the shot process and letting the pin float, just being comfortable with it.
Yep.
And, you know, and confidence. Like when you're shooting at 100 yards or 80 yards or 50, 60 yards, and you can consistently, you know, put it in, you know, the kill zone on a 3D target. Well, then when that shot comes in at 20 yards, it's like, I'm not even thinking, oh, am I going to miss it, or am I going to mess this shot up? It's, you pick a spot and it's there.
Yeah. And
back to Adam's setup, he does have a 10-inch stabilizer on it, but that's one thing when I went to put that on, I was like, holy cow, this thing is super light. Like he hardly has any weight. So that was, you know, I had it on the bow, but it definitely needs some adjustment. I haven't shot that bow since he first bought it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I know hunting is like, you know, bow hunting specifically is, you know, is about getting close to the animal, and I'm 100% on board with that. But it does feel good when you are able to practice at those longer distances, and like you said, you get more confident. It just makes those shorter shots just feel so automatic. Like you almost like you can't even mess it up. It like doesn't even come into your mind that you could possibly miss this. Where before, I mean, it was a very, very real possibility that I was going to miss this or screw it up. But it does feel good too. Like I find often, or I'm really comfortable in that kind of like 30 to 40 range. And so what a lot of times what I find in my setups now is I'm setting up back a little bit from where I used to, which has given me a little more, a little more forgiveness with the wind and the swirling, and I'm out of the view. I'm not quite like in their face all the time. I'm not saying all the time, but if there's an opportunity there, I find myself hunting back just a little because I do feel a little, more confident, with that 30, 35-yard shot. So I'll get kind of out of their bubble a little bit and kind of let things materialize in front of me instead of like in the past where I would get like right in there with them, 15 yards or whatever. And a lot of times, thermals or, get you, or this doe over here that you didn't see, get you as you're kind of shifting around. So it does have some benefits there, and I'm not one to condone long shots or say people should be taking long shots, but it does open up some doors there and does give you some confidence in those like normal bow hunting ranges.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome, to have you on here and talk. I wanted to talk more towards the listeners' side of it because of the way that you are able to capitalize and the humble nature. You talk about like these deer that you've killed, and you've been keeping a log for what are we at, 22 years now, and it isn't overnight success. It isn't Dan Infalt says the fairy dust, but there isn't a product that's out there that you said, man, as soon as I bought such and such, like this is the way that it is. And, you are involved in a lot of different things. Like you said, you've written articles, you're, frequently on Wired to Hunt and, the tethered guys and all of that. And, you come on here to talk with us about trying to be a little bit more efficient, and then you jump right over into the John nerd out about bows, but not only talk about that in setups and a lot of people have an agenda, when they want to talk about their bows, or they want to say, okay, well, you need to do this, or everything is absolute. And you're saying, look, this is why the archery component, why, in for me, kind of put everything in perspective, because John tells me all this stuff all the time. Like, I'm very fortunate is I have a John in my life that's like, he's building strings, he's building arrows, he's tuning bows, he's doing all of this stuff, but it's kind of like when your mom tells you all this stuff and you're like, you know what, I know, I'm sure you're right. But then for you to come on here and then explain, like, okay, this is why I'm doing it, this is why, and this is where I think that that's important. I think that's a really great, not only for myself, but for the listener as well, because to be able to have somebody, that we want to have on as a guest for helping our listeners and to, be more efficient, to have a little bit better success rates, and then be able to tie it right back into, kind of like the way that John and I play off one another is I just, do whatever I want to. He's the guy that's very laser focused and, all of that. But I think that's probably one of the best explanations that I've ever heard. In doing this and asking the questions as far as like stabilization is one of the questions that I get asked, or that we get fielded all the time, is about why or how do you pick your stabilizer or whatever. And tying that right back into hunting versus the target archery side or things like that, is pretty awesome. And I really do appreciate that, whether, you think it's a rabbit hole or kind of off topic or whatever. But, so we've been on here for 2 hours now, and I don't want to keep you too much longer. Where can people follow along with whatever you're doing or kind of your stuff? You talked about a little bit of filming, you do the Wire to Hunt stuff, you're with Tethered and those guys. So, if people have questions, or they're like, man, I really like this guy, how can we follow along with all the things that you're doing?
Yeah. So I think that's kind of a misconception. Like I don't really put out like any content. I'm not selling anything. I'm not even trying to like self promote at all. Um, I have an Instagram page. If you want to follow it, that's fine. I don't post on it much. I'll post some hunting stuff once in a while. You'll probably see some stuff with me and my daughter on there. But that's Bow Hunting Dad on Instagram. Facebook is just for my family, so I don't try to find me on there. And then don't expect too much. I'm not trying to become famous or even really try to like make it in the hunting industry. Like I'm if I'm known for anything, I'm known as just the regular guy that works two jobs, that has a family, that has limited time to hunt, but still kind of prioritizes it enough to get out there and have some success. And I've done it in a lot of different states. I've hunted as far west as Colorado and all the way to Maryland and pretty much everything in between. So I do have quite a bit of experience. I love talking hunting. I do get a lot of messages. So like I'll definitely reach back out, but it might be a while if someone did message me. But that's about it, man. I'm not really. I wish I could say wait for my video to drop or something, but there's none coming. So.
Well, I really appreciate that, and that being said, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk with us and kind of basically talk directly to the listeners because, like you said, that everyman, that humble, that not trying to sell anything, but having the success is we've said it on here no matter who we talk to, but there's a lot of guys out there that you don't know their names, that they're incredible hunters that don't want any recognition or anything, and those are the ones that we could all learn a lot from.
Yeah.
So
yeah, for sure. That was real quick. That was me forever. Like I think I told you before we started recording. Mark Kenyon at Wired to Hunt asked me to go on his podcast for it was like 2.5 years before I said yes. I kept telling him no. I didn't feel comfortable with it. I wasn't trying to be secretive or anything. It's not my way really to sit there and talk about myself. But then he finally he was persistent and he said, "Don't think of it as talking about yourself. Think of it as you're just talking about hunting with me, your buddy, and it might help people out there." And that I guess that's what kind of hooked me because there were people that helped me. And I'm not saying I'm the greatest teacher or I know everything. I absolutely do not. I make a ton of mistakes every year, but there were people out there that took the time to give me some advice and some direction, when I sought it out. So I guess that was my way to kind of do that a little bit back. And now I've been on a few now, and so I'm a little more comfortable with it now, but I appreciate you guys having me.
no problem, man.
Yeah.
Honestly, hopefully we'll get to meet up again in person someday when this is all over. But
Yeah, right.
yeah, we look forward to that. But I think that's all we got for this evening. So I really appreciate it, Andy.
All right.
Right.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys.